This is Your Own Best Company, a podcast for people who love to work alone. Hey everybody, Franklin Taggart here, and this is Your Own Best Company, a podcast for people who love working alone. And I'm delighted to welcome back my really dear friend, Teresa Funke. Teresa and I have had some wonderful conversations lately, and I want to let you in on some of what we've talked about. How are you, Teresa?
I'm good. How are you, Franklin?
I'm doing real well. For the folks who don't know Teresa, Teresa is an author and publisher and has been in the writing and publishing business for over 30 years. The last time that we had her as a guest on the podcast, we were talking about kind of taking I think we called it an accidental sabbatical. Was that what we termed it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And now we're back to kind of follow up and find out what's happened since the sabbatical has terminated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the last time we talked, I was 6 months into the sabbatical.
Yeah.
And at the time, I thought it was going to be a 6-month sabbatical. I thought that somehow, miraculously, between June and December, I was going to figure everything out. And by the end of December, I was going to know what my new directions were and, how to resolve some of the issues going on in my life. And December 31st kind of came and went, and I still hadn't figured it out. And my daughter said, well, what are you going to call it now? And I said, I guess I'm going to call it an extended sabbatical. So I was on extended sabbatical until June, still trying to figure things out, had a really challenging spring, lots of personal problems and health problems, and just, still trying to figure the work stuff out.
Yeah.
And come the end of June, I was like, okay, now it's been a year. I just absolutely cannot call it a sabbatical anymore. So I finally came to the decision that I actually went to a doctor's appointment, and there was a form, and you could, put on the form, are you retired? Are you a student? Are you full-time? Are you part-time?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, part-time. That's me. And I checked the box, and then I felt really good about that. I'm part-time. And I've been leaning into that for the last few months and just really, really enjoying, after all these years, going to the part-time status. So that's how that wound up.
How has determining that changed anything?
It's actually changed a lot of things. Part of what was going on, and you were a big help in this, Franklin, was that over that year of sabbatical, after 30 years, because I hit 30 years as a professional writer last October.
Mm-hmm.
So part of what was going on during that year was just realizing that something was coming to an end that I loved and that I was absolutely passionate about and I was really, really good at.
Yeah.
And you kind of encouraged me to go ahead and grieve that a little bit. And I didn't want to, because I'm a 7 on the Enneagram, and we're futurists, and we don't like to be in pain at all. And so I didn't want to go to a space of grieving. But there were a lot of things I was grieving, not just my work, but some personal things at that time that I hadn't been willing to do.
Yeah.
And so going through that process of saying, yeah, I'm super proud of what I've accomplished in my business. I will always be really proud of my books and the programs I built and the coaching that I did and the influence I've had. But there were some goals, dreams, whatever you want to call them, that never did come true and probably weren't going to.
Yeah.
So probably part of the grieving was just letting go of, always thinking maybe those things were possible.
Yeah.
And then just letting go of things that it felt so irresponsible to stop doing things that I was good at and I knew how to do and were not difficult. It just felt irresponsible to walk away from skills and talent and money and leave it on the table. So I was dealing with that too. Somewhat grief, somewhat guilt, and definitely identity. Like, okay, well, if I'm not Teresa, the writer, the publisher, the speaker, the trendsetter, then what am I going to be? So It was a lot. It was a lot. And I think a lot of people are going through that right now. I have seen it happening right and left. And I'm so glad I gave myself permission to go through that transformation.
What What were the supports that you found as you were going through that grieving process?
Well, there were a few friends, you especially,
Yeah,
that really helped me get through that process and encouraged me to not worry that I was going to get stuck there in that
yeah,
grief and that, despair, because that's a real concern for sevens,
yeah.
is that we're going to get stuck in any kind of quote negative feeling. And so having a good friend who's familiar with the Enneagram, who was just kind of coaching me through, look, this is a resistance that you have
Hmm.
because you're afraid that if you're not going to be that person again. And so what if you're not? It's okay to be somebody else. And so she kind of coached me through, part of what I was experiencing was some fear.
Yeah,
So, yeah, I had really good friends. I had a very supportive husband who's always been there for me, regardless of where I am. He's always just been really supportive. Even when I was feeling down, he was very supportive. So I'm very lucky in that sense.
and he's a steady rock star. He's just one of those guys. It's like,
Yeah.
you can totally count on Roger.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And he's funny. So he was making me laugh even when I didn't want to.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So how did you really know that you were reaching the end of that sabbatical period?
That's a good question too, because I think in all fairness, some things were resolving on their own. Some of my health issues resolved, some personal issues resolved in my extended family.
Hmm.
So in a way, I was able to move on because those things kind of went behind me.
Hmm.
But in another way, I kind of had to decide I don't want to be in a state of anxiety and despair anymore. And, what is that going to take for me to come out of that, to get back to a place where I can just be in the present
Yeah.
and not worried about the future or regretting the past. And part of that was making the decision to go back to Ireland for 3 weeks
Yeah.
in September, which was, our happy place. And we just feel really at home there and really comfortable there. And I just wanted to go back to a place where I could just be really comfortable and at peace and just sit with all of this, sit with everything that had happened. And so that turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful trip.
Yeah.
I broke my collarbone while I was there
Oh my gosh.
on day 5 of a 3-week trip. Here I was thinking I was done with doctors, and I wind up in the emergency room in Ireland. And I think it was actually really a blessing. And I don't say that lightly, and I don't say that in some flippant woo-woo way.
No.
It was a blessing that it happened because it even more so than anything else really slowed me down and put me back in the moment and just appreciating every little thing that we did and saw and how I was able to heal,
Yeah.
from an injury. I'd never had a broken bone before. And
Wow.
just noticing, just really noticing and being present more so than I had been at any other point in my life, because we were in a foreign country. We were not at our home. There were no obligations or responsibilities. And I was healing from a broken bone. So you move
Yeah.
a lot slower.
Well, based on the literature that I've read, Ireland seems like a really good place to grieve.
Yes. Yeah.
It seems
We,
like, the stories that come from there are just stories about people resolving all of these things,
yes. Read
somehow.
their poetry and listen to their songs and ballads, and that they definitely are healthy people in terms of like, you know, feeling those emotions.
Yeah.
So,
Well, one of the things that has come up in our conversations, you and I went through and read the book Bittersweet by Susan Cain together not too long ago, and that book really registered, I think, for both of us. And one of the things that came forward in our talks about that were how many artists we know, or how many creative people we know, who really have grief as a pretty central part of their experience.
mhm.
And I'm curious as to what you have learned through your own experience that you've now seen reflected maybe in some other artists as well.
I think definitely there was a big shift And I wouldn't even say in the beginning of the pandemic, it felt like artists were working really hard to figure out how to pivot.
Hmm.
Remember that word?
Oh, yeah.
um, we were, okay, I better do online courses. I better, record my music and do a FaceTime live, concert. And so it seemed like in the beginning, we didn't have a chance to sort of grieve. What does this pandemic mean for us? How does it change our lives and our art? A lot
Hmm.
of us, our revenue streams dip dramatically. And what did that do for our motivation, for our inspiration, all of those things? And now that we're kind of sort of coming out of the pandemic, I mean, COVID is still there, but coming out of that pandemic era, what I'm seeing is that a lot of artists are now experiencing those moments of you know contemplation and
Hmm.
questioning, and maybe even a little bit of regret or grief, and taking some time off to
Oh,
say,
yeah.
what did I learn from this whole pandemic experience, and how did it change me, and what do I want to be now?
Yeah. Who am I now, right?
Who am I now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Collectively, we've all been through a major change. And I think our industry maybe felt a bit of a burden to, it was our job as artists to keep people's spirits up.
Yeah.
People turn to art. And now we're taking some time for ourselves and saying, I need to process what happened in this time.
Yeah. I think there's definitely something to that observation. I've seen a lot of people go through some pretty major transformations in their understanding of who they are, particularly as artists. And I saw a lot of folks who left they left their art thing behind during the pandemic and went into a more conventional thing like sales or something like that. And now they're starting to revisit their art and their creativity, and they're saying, "Oh, what am I going to do with this now?" And it's like, how do I come back to this as I am now,
Right.
because I'm not the same as I was back then, right? And so it's been interesting to see just how that whole experience has changed things for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's for everyone, but I know most of the artists and creative people that I know used that time in ways that now they're coming back, and it feels very different than it did before.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's okay. And I think that was one of the big things that just really lifted my spirits this summer, was just realizing that it's okay to be different, that it's okay to stop doing things we've done for a long time, and it's okay to stop doing things that we're good at,
Yeah.
and it's okay to become someone else and pick up a different art or try a different medium, or stop doing your art to do something else you've always wanted to do.
Yeah.
And there's such pressure on artists, and you and I talk about this a lot, that people would say to me, well, you're not retired, are you? Because you can't retire. You're an author. You have a gift. You have like a responsibility to that gift.
Yeah.
Like, you're not allowed to stop writing until you die because you have this gift. And I thought, that's a lot of pressure to put on artists. Like, you don't tell
Hmm.
a dentist after 30 years, you can't quit. You have a gift. You say, good for you. And you have that retirement party. Um, and so I think artists are sort of unnecessarily burdened with this concept of, you're not allowed to change because you're good at what you're good at.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
You have a gift. You should use it. Well,
Right.
the funny thing is, though, Teresa, I find that an interesting perception, because you never stopped writing the whole time.
Yeah.
I mean, you were constantly, you were still writing your blog
Hmm.
frequently, and you were still publishing your newsletters. You may have missed 1 month of your newsletter, but you were still writing pretty much through the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's just, I think one of the things that's interesting is that people kind of have a pigeonhole of, oh, I'm not working on a book, or I'm not doing a big project right now, right?
Yeah. I just got asked that question the other day. What are you writing now? And I said, well, I still write my weekly inspirational blog.
Yeah.
And they're like, but no books. You're not working on a book? And I was like, nope. And, I think that there is this I've published 8 books.
Yeah.
So there's this expectation that when's the next book coming out? And at the moment I'm like, I don't know. It maybe never, maybe next year. I'm open to whatever. But yeah, I think people do put that pressure. I mean, I write this weekly inspirational blog, and I did do it through the turmoil of the pandemic and through my personal turmoil.
Mm-hmm.
I was writing that blog, but it was that was part of my healing too, because I was working out in the blog. How does it feel to be an artist during the pandemic? And how do I feel about this place I am now? When I was feeling really down, like, what is this trying to tell me? What is this despair and this anxiety telling me? And, people really resonated with those blog posts. I got a lot of comments from people saying, that's how I feel right now.
Yeah.
And now that I'm back to like a better place of feeling inspired again, people are resonating with that and commenting, I'm feeling that way too. So I think it was important, not just for me to continue the blog for myself and my own healing and journey, but there was a sense of community for me too, from having people respond and say, you nailed it.
Yeah.
That's what I'm experiencing as well.
I'd like to get back to the book Bittersweet just for a minute. I'm going to just talk out of school here and just say that for me it was an interesting book to read because it was very, very close to my experience. But it felt like to me that you had an even more kind of a kindred recognition in that book than I had. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, I felt like that book validated my whole existence in a way, if that sounds a little dramatic, because I didn't have a term until Bittersweet came along for somebody who, ever since I was a child, would feel, such sadness and such joy all in the same day.
Yeah.
And from a similar experience, and not knowing really how to process that as a kid and as a teenager. And, we live in a society where people are like, keep your chin up, or look on the bright side, or always have that glass half full. And there were times when I did not feel that way. And I wouldn't say that I was ever depressed when I was a teenager. But I was definitely bittersweet about things. I would need to be in a space of kind of that deep contemplation of, this is sad, this is hard, this is difficult, the world is difficult, people are suffering, and I want to acknowledge that without seeming like I'm some sort of pessimist or downer. I want to acknowledge that suffering in the world, and not that means that you don't also acknowledge the beauty.
Yeah.
And I think that was what was so great about Bittersweet, is that there are people who do both on a routine basis. And so it felt very validating to me.
I think that aspect of who you are also comes through in the empathy of your writing. I haven't read all of your books yet, but the few that I have read, there's a high level of empathy that comes through, of really feeling the experience and not just describing it.
Yeah.
So maybe that experience that you had when you were younger, and that you continue to have now, really informed that level of empathy.
Well, yeah, that's what drew me to writing in the first place, really.
Tell me about that.
Well, I wanted to be a writer since I was in the 5th grade, but a big part of it, for me, it was never about my own ideas. This is hard to explain, because I'm not saying I never did write something straight out of my own imagination.
Yeah.
But the very first poem I wrote that got published when I was in the 6th grade was a poem about two friends starting out friends as kids and growing old together.
Huh.
What 6th grader writes that? And it was actually a really good poem. It was like the different stages of their lives as they grow old together.
Yeah.
So I was always aware from an early age that there's phases in life and steps in life. And when I was a teenager, I just wanted to be a teenager. I wasn't like my friends who wanted to grow up. I was like, there's something to be learned from this stage.
Yeah.
And when I was in college, I was like, I'm going to just enjoy this college experience. And then when I was a young married woman, and so for me, it was always about that concept of how do we grow within ourselves. And that's what fascinated me about the stories I wrote, which were usually about real people that I interviewed. What did you learn from this? What was that experience like? What did it feel like?
Yeah.
How were times different then? Where do you think we're going to go now that you went through that? How have we all changed? Like, that's what the writing was always about.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of a couple of your books in particular. Dancing in Combat Boots is one where you really captured several experiences of different women in World War II, and those stories were they were on the page. It was like there was a palpable feeling that came from those stories.
Mm-hmm.
So you really captured the feeling that those women were expressing underneath their story.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Can you tell me a little bit about, as you've come back and you've identified now that you're working part-time, what are the things that you've done for years that you've let go of?
Well, it was a process. It's like sort of one thing at a time. It's not like I blew up the ship. Like,
No.
that I couldn't have done it. I just couldn't have done it. I had to let things go one thing at a time.
Yeah.
So, last year I didn't do my great book giveaway for the first time in 13 years, which is when I give, a couple thousand books to organizations that work with at-risk, low-income and Latino families in town.
Mm-hmm.
And I just needed a rest from the holidays and those parties. And so that was like one of the first things to go. And then I started looking like my author visit program, which I'd built up, and I'd been speaking in schools. I have been for 19 years.
Yeah.
But this author visit program was pretty special, and it ran in a really efficient way. And it was very much valued in the community. But things are shifting. Post-pandemic, the education world looks a little different.
Mm-hmm.
Teachers feel different, and they still want those school visits, but things have changed a little bit. And so it felt like a good time to let that go. That was really hard to let that one go because I was really proud of that program. So just kind of slowly inching out of things and saying each time, pausing to say, how does this feel?
Yeah.
Does this feel like something I want to bring back next year? Am I just taking a break? Or does this feel like something that has reached the end of its life cycle and it needs to stop or become something else now?
Yeah.
So I really needed that space to just ask myself, how does it feel to not be doing these things?
Yeah. What are some of the like kind of day-to-day tasks that have shifted?
Well, for one thing, this is my office down here.
Yeah.
I'm not down here very much anymore. And it's a basement office. And that was a functionality thing when my kids were little. It made sense for me to be in the basement where I could be away from them and concentrate. But being out of this basement has been really liberating. I'm spending more of my day upstairs looking out the window and seeing people walk by and sitting outside and waving at the neighbors. And so that's a big change. I valued this office when I was writing, especially because I could spread everything out and I could be very focused and concentrated.
Yeah.
And so this space is special to me, but it feels really good now to not go down into the basement as much anymore.
Wow, cool.
So I know, isn't that funny? That's what came to mind when you asked that question.
That's an interesting answer.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing that I'm really curious about is how have you gotten comfortable living with kind of the gap between what used to be and what hasn't happened yet?
Oh, interesting. What used to be and what hasn't happened yet. That's a great question because my husband and I both used, I think for the first time since this kind of shift has been taking place in me, in September, we used the word excited. So we both feel really excited about kind of what's coming next. And for once, I'm an activator, I'm a, doer, I'm a semi-ambitious person. And so for the longest time, it felt really uncomfortable and scary to be in a place where I didn't know what was coming next.
Yeah.
And now I'm comfortable there because now the way I feel is, oh, well, there's endless possibility. So, what in the end is going to actually capture my interest enough that I take those steps towards moving forward. And I'm contemplating a few ideas of what that would look like, and kind of excited to kind of, you know, rumble around with those and say, is this going to be it? Is that going to be it? So
Yeah.
yeah, it doesn't mean that I've stopped, and it doesn't mean I'm no longer interested in being creative, but I didn't want to put pressure on what does the new me look like. I just wanted to kind of let her emerge.
Yeah. You didn't have to figure it all out on, over a lunch period.
Yeah, I tried. In the beginning, I tried really hard, and that just made things worse.
In what ways?
It just made me more down,
Yeah.
because I don't have the answer. I can't figure this out. That's a lot of pressure to put on yourself. So,
Is that something that's common to that Enneagram type? Having to know things ahead of time?
yes, sevens are
Okay.
planners big time.
All right.
We feel more secure with a plan.
Yeah. And so you've really you've faced that and now have gotten comfortable kind of in the unknown
Yeah,
part of it.
yeah, it's a pretty fascinating place.
That's very cool. I'm very curious then as to what are the possibilities that you're starting to explore now?
Well, I still very much love the arts, and I've
Yeah.
always loved the arts, and I've always been an advocate for the arts. And one of my passions has always been how, where do the arts intersect, and how do we cross promote, and how do we introduce people who go to the theater all the time, but don't really have a lot of visual art in their house to consider those two things together. So some of the projects I'm looking at are finding ways to showcase artists together.
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the things I'm liking about this new direction I'm taking is that I was a writer's coach for 17 years. I've been teaching about writing for 20 years. And now I get to talk about art in all its forms and art in the broader picture. And I'm really enjoying that because having been an arts enthusiast all my life, I know a fair amount about the music industry and the visual arts industry and the performing arts industry for sure. So now to be able to say, I get to explore those things and get a little bit more depth and knowledge in those areas that's exciting. It's like, I still enjoy talking to people about writing, but it's exciting to have new things for me to learn and new conversations for me to have. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Talk about those conversations. It's like, what are those? How do those come about?
Well, I think one thing I'm really interested in right now is just the direction the arts are going to take, because we are definitely seeing that post-pandemic, some things are not going to go back to the way they were before.
Yeah.
And in this era of social media, like, it's confusing. Does social media matter? Does it not matter? Like, where do we reach our audiences, and how do we reach them in a way that they want now that things have changed? And even what do we sacrifice when we try to please everyone?
Oof.
Because I'm not saying that I don't support hybrid events, but then people are, some people are there in person, some people are watching it later, some people are watching some in person and some later, and it's not a common experience. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I don't know. So,
Yeah.
I just think it's really a fascinating time for the arts right now.
Important questions for sure. Do you have a sense of some of the things that you would like to see happen next?
No, that's a big question.
Mhm.
Like, I think in my industry, in the writing industry, change has needed to come for a very long time. And, we're seeing some things that are, it's taking so long to hear back because there's been so much consolidation and so many layoffs, and editors are now doing 14 jobs. And
Yeah.
what it's creating is an environment where it's harder and harder for the new writers to break out, right, and get the support that they once had. And so I think we're seeing interesting shifts towards even a lot of people who were traditionally published or embracing self-publishing now for some of their projects. And a
Mhm.
lot of people don't even want to try to go the traditional route anymore.
Yeah.
They're going straight to self-publishing. And that's been happening for a while. But I just think it's going to be an interesting time for writers to have to say, how does this shift when we don't even hear back from an editor or an agent? They're
Yeah.
like, if you don't hear from us, it means we're not taking it. Well, how long do you wait? And what
Yeah.
does that mean? And did they read it or not read it? It's a very unfair time in some ways to be an artist. And so I advocate for artists, but I'm also an arts enthusiast myself. And I understand that people have challenges. And one of my goals is to bring the arts to people who can't necessarily afford to go to the arts. So where do those two things intersect? Where's that intersection between an artist's right to make money and for their work to be valued
Yeah.
and for all people to have access to the art? Where does that intersect and how does that become more fair than it currently is?
Well, one of the very tangible and practical ways that you embodied that last statement of bringing the arts to people who don't have access. You and Roger created a little library and installed it in a local neighborhood. Um, Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, that was fun because I do love working with kids. And I was worried that if I wasn't doing as many school visits, I would miss that.
Yeah.
But I have been noticing for a long time that one of the challenges with lower income communities is getting the kids to the library. And a lot of them live on the outskirts of town where it's not easy for the kids to ride their bikes to the library. And their
Yeah.
parents are working two jobs and they have one car. And, it's easy to say, well, those parents have a responsibility to get their kids to the library, but it's not that simple.
Yeah.
And so if we can take the books to them and they can choose the books they want, and if they want, they can keep a book if they love it. A lot of lower income families do not own their own books. And yet we know that book ownership is really important to education in terms of test scores and staying in school and all of those things. So yeah, that's a real goal of mine is to work out the kinks and systems like that. And then what I typically do, and this from my website, is I just go share that idea. I
Yeah.
say, here's what worked for me. Anyone in the country, take the idea and go out and do it in your own community and see how it works for you. And so, that's kind of what I'm working through right now is, what are the kinks in the system? We've had to restock the library a lot more than we thought we would.
Yeah.
There's more families than we thought that are using it, and more kids are keeping the books than we thought. So if I can work these details out and I can share that, maybe these ideas can spread and do good in lots of places. So
And you got to meet some of the kids as you guys were setting up the library, and you got to ask them like what kinds of books they would like to read and what kinds of books they would like to have.
yeah,
And so one of the things that you're really facilitating here is that they'll not only be able to read the books, if they want to, they can keep them.
absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
And one of the little girls asked me that, do we have to bring them back? And I said, look, here's what I think. If you love that book and you think you might read it again, you can keep it as long as you want.
Yeah.
But if you just kind of liked it, put it back so someone else can read it. And she said, okay, I got it. That's
Yeah.
great. So yeah.
Now
It's
your
been
initial installation wasn't flawless. Can you talk a
No,
little bit about that?
it wasn't flawless. And and typically whenever you start a new program, there's a learning curve. And
Mhm.
uh, so we had it installed in kind of a community air section of that neighborhood. And there was a park there. And I think it was the teenagers bored at night were breaking the glass on the front of the Little Free Library. And
Which was
so
unbreakable plexiglass, by
it
the
was
way.
it was unbreakable. Well, yeah, it was plexiglass that was supposed to be unbreakable. Apparently not.
Turned out to be breakable.
Yeah, and that happened a few times. And so we had to take some measures and we're actually moving the library to a different location.
Yeah.
And, it's not uncommon for any park to have issues. So it wasn't a huge surprise and I'm not devastated by it. It was just like the question was, okay, what do we do to fix this? Because we had to remove the library because it had become unsafe. And then the kids were running up to me going, where are you taking the book box? Where's the books box going? And I said, it'll be back. We just have to figure this out.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but I like those kinds of challenges because nothing we do is necessarily, oh, a lot of times we want to do something quick and easy and good
Yeah.
to feel good. And it doesn't work that way all the time. And so
No.
you got to hang in there a bit.
The other thing that I really loved about that project was that you ended up having a collaboration with an artist. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. One of the ladies who lives in the neighborhood, her 10-year-old daughter painted the library for us.
Yeah.
And that was pretty special because the library is for kids. So to have a 10-year-old paint it, she painted little different pictures around the library. And the one thing, when the vandalism occurred, they didn't touch the painting.
Yeah.
And I knew they wouldn't. I knew that they would respect, they could see that a child had done it, and they did not like graffiti, the box itself. So, and I kind of knew that would be the case. So,
Yeah.
but she was very proud of it, and we were super proud to have her work on there, representing her community and representing the youth that are using it. So that was pretty cool too.
Well, one of the things that I just love about that project is that it's a very practical way to raise the bar for people who otherwise may not have the opportunity. And I love to see projects like that. Projects like that give me hope.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. And I just want to encourage people that if you have questions about how to do such a thing, that you might get in touch with Teresa through her website. Do you want them to go through burstofbrilliance.com?
Burstofbrilliance.com, with bursts with an S,
Yeah.
is one way to reach me. And that's where you can see my weekly blog. And then teresafunke.com is also a good way to reach me. That's TeresaFunke.com. And you can reach me there. And that way you'll see my books, all the writing materials and the writing information and resources that I share. And more information about these community projects that I've done for years. And some of them are ongoing, and some new ones are coming up.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that Teresa has books both for young and older readers.
Yes.
So they're not just for kids and they're not just for adults. She's got a nice mix. Teresa, I'm excited to see what unfolds next for you. I think it's going to be a very exciting time. And I know our community is going to benefit from whatever it becomes. But is there anything that you would like to encourage people with in closing today?
Just that, I had always been sort of an optimistic person my whole life, and hitting that patch of all of those things coming together at once this spring, the health, the personal issues, the career challenges, all of that, I did experience some depression. And I always thought I would not be that person, and so that was a good thing for me to realize. And so if you are feeling down, if you're feeling anxious, then reach out and get some help, because it's not a fun place to be. And it's definitely not a fun place to be alone.
Yeah.
But hopefully you can get some support and maybe start to heal, but do it your own way. Like, find what works for you, find how you heal. A lot of people are going to give you advice. But you know yourself better than anyone else does. And so lean into it for yourself.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, my guest today has been Teresa Funke, and Teresa will be back again, I'm sure, because I look forward to every conversation. We tend to be able to go places that are both interesting and meaningful, and we can go deep, and I appreciate that about you.
I love it. I love our conversations.
Well, we'll have another one soon.
Thank you.
Folks, I also want to just put the word in there for Teresa's book, Bursts of Brilliance for a Creative Life. One of my favorite books of the last few years, and I recommend it to everybody. I'm going to put a link in the description for that book, and I want you to read it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Your Own Best Company. If you enjoyed the show, would you do me a favor and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast host? If you really love it, leave me a review or share it with your circles. If you feel like your career is reaching a dead end, or you're feeling a deep sense of dissatisfaction in your work right now, I help people discover their gifts and then find or create new opportunities that are the best fit for their talent, experience, and lifestyle. Email me at coaching@franklintaggart.com for more information. I also help people start, finish, and launch creative projects, and I offer an ongoing marketing mastermind for solopreneurs and freelancers. More information on these programs and services can be found at franklintaggart.com. Thanks again for spending this time with me.